Welcome to Nevada Historical Society High Noon Series with Neal Cobb. Today's topic is Death Valley Gold Rush of the earliest 20th century. It's presented by accomplished film producer and author Ted Faye. My name is Morgan. I work for Washoe County Library System. Thank you so much for being here today. And now I would like to introduce Sherilyn Hayes Zorn from the Nevada Historical Society.
Thanks, Morgan. Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today and joining us here at High Noon. As always, we always want to thank the Washoe County Library System for being such great partners with us over the years to help us allow us to do High Noon online and really be able to get great stories, even for people that are across the state, out of state. It's made a difference, and we so appreciate you joining us today. And as always, thank you for Tim and John, who are our tech guys that are behind the scenes and deal with the editing and getting this video up on YouTube. And I'm behind a couple months, but we always have links on our website as well, so you can check out these videos. But I want to introduce our wonderful host that's been a longtime supporter here at the Nevada Historical Society. Neal Cobb has been part of our family since 1988, and we so appreciate his passion about history and trying to get the word out about the Historical Society and about the great stories that are about Reno and Nevada. So without further ado, let me introduce Neal Cobb. Hey, Neal.
Thank you, Sherry. Very much appreciate the intro on there. Our speaker today, I'm very honored to tell you all about. His name is Ted Faye, an accomplished producer and author who is a passionate storyteller who explores history and culture. He produced Iverson, the definitive documentary on NBA superstar Allen Iverson, which aired on Showtime and Netflix. He produced Weird Tales series and the Tales from Death Valley, bringing unique narratives to life on screen. He has worked extensively with Nevada communities and travel Nevada to promote culture and heritage tourism. As an author, he has written Death Valley Gold Rush, the 20 Mule Team of Death Valley, and Goldfield. He appreciates the rich past of the American West, a graduate of UCLA, and an MFA in film and television. Faye continues to craft compelling stories and blend history, mystery, and adventure. Please welcome at this time our speaker today, Ted Faye.
Well, thank you, Neal. I really appreciate that introduction, and I appreciate the Nevada Historical Society and all the work that they do. I got to know Sherry a number of years ago when I was doing a documentary on death in the desert and folks who have met their demise in the heat of deserts in Nevada and of course in Death Valley. I'm a Pittsburgh boy. I was raised in the East. I was there in the snow and the wind and the cold, and people ask me, how did you ever get interested in the desert? And I always tell the story that when I was a kid, I was in the basement probably one cold, snowy day, and I had a Viewmaster, and a lot of you probably know those. And I I remember looking at one of the slides with this particular slide that went around. For those of you that don't know, the Viewmaster, you put in a little slide and it goes around a circle. And it said it was a USUP plant, a YUCCA plant. I'd never heard of that before, and it was in the Mojave Desert. And I thought, my gosh, how interesting, how fascinating this place looks. So it was some time later before I found out, of course, it was a yucca plant in the Mojave Desert. But when I first moved to California in a long time ago, the first park I ever visited was not the treed, mountainous, beautiful Sierras or Yosemite or Kings Canyon or any of those beautiful parks. The first park I visited was Death Valley. So with that said, I'm going to kick into our slideshow here, and we're going to start down the path of the Death Valley Gold Rush. Um, this was a subject that really fascinated me because I thought, I know about the California Gold Rush in 1849 and the rush west from all parts of the country to get to Sutter's Mill, but I really didn't know about a gold rush in Death Valley until I really started researching it way back in 1992 was when I really first started getting fascinated with Death Valley. It was about maybe 12 or 13 years after I moved to California that I really started looking at it as a potential subject for a documentary because I had seen Ken Burns' Civil War and I had just done my first documentary on runaway kids in Hollywood, and I thought, oh my gosh, um, what if I could do my own documentary here on Death Valley? So in 1992, I decided to do a documentary film on the history of Death Valley. And the first thing I did was I read a book called Death Valley and the Amargosa by Richard Lingenfelter. And this book uh, really laid out the story in a really compelling way. And I thought, man, these are great stories. So I decided to take a trip to Death Valley. And for those of you who don't know exactly where it is, so here's Las Vegas, and about an hour and a half northwest or so is Death Valley National Park. So I went to Death Valley in 1992, and this is what I encountered and what you would encounter if you went to the heart of Death Valley. Death Valley proper, the heart of the valley. Of course, my friend Richard Lingenfelter, who wrote the book on Death Valley, would always say Death Valley has no heart. But in the center of Death Valley, you would come across this, which is called the Devil's Golf Course, which is a particularly nasty, salty, muddy, crusty uprising of all sorts of formations out there that is really just horrible to walk across. And of course, here I am walking across it. This is 1992, my first sort of exploration trip out to Death Valley. And we were on the West Side Road, which is over there. And we were in a Jeep and we had a flat tire. And so we had plenty of water in the car. And so I very intelligently turned to my friend and I said, hey, that doesn't look like so far across the valley to the paved road. Why don't we go over there? And so we started to walk across the valley. I will tell you that walking across Death Valley, at that point, it's about 8 miles wide. And I will tell you that it was the most horrific trip across a flat piece of land I've ever had in my life. Because we started out on what was called the West Side Road, which is a dirt road, which is where we had our flat tire. And then we started walking and it was kind of okay. And then it started to get really muddy. And I never and it's May and it's dry and it's Memorial Day weekend, quite frankly, and it's starting to get mucky, and I start to sink, and I literally went down up to my knees, and so I'm like, oh my gosh! So we got out of the mud and we start walking across a little bit more, and it's sandy. Then it starts to get a little sandy, and then you hit what's something called in the middle of the valley. You hit something called desert pavement, And this is literally, it's like a paved road. It's like that hard, but on the surface there is fine little tiny, I don't know, like grains of sand, only more rock-like. And those, there is a wind out there and it whips up and it literally goes into your face, and it's, you have to put up, you have to cover your face out there in the middle of the valley. Then once you get past that, then you get into this area that we're talking about, the Devil's Golf Course, where it literally cuts your shoes, hurts your feet. You can't walk on it. It's not level. And by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we had started out, I think about, I'm not, I think we started out about 3 in the afternoon. About 4 hours into this hike, we were not close to the paved road on the other side. And so we thought we'd sleep, we had our sleeping bags, rolled them out, slept on the valley floor. My friend noticed that I was getting delirious, which is what happens in that kind of environment. You start to not have your full senses. So got up the next morning, got up early, made it to the road, and a red convertible comes driving by, and there's a lady in a headscarf in the passenger seat. They stop. She gets out. She's French. Oh, is there a problem? Like, yes, there's a problem. She said, oh, she went to the back of her car, opened it up, there was a cooler there, and she pulls out the coldest ice cold Coke I had ever had in my life. And I thought, oh my gosh, the camera should be rolling because this is a commercial for Coca-Cola. Anyway, that's how we survived. Finally got back and did make it across Death Valley. While I was hiking, I thought of these guys, these pioneers, these 49ers that in 1849 decided to come west. And there was this group that had met up in Salt Lake City, and they had come from all over the country, and they had met up here in Salt Lake City. And they were following the California Trail, which you can see here. They were following the California Trail, and they they got there in October. They were called the San Joaquin Company, and they got there in October, and they said, you know, we could keep going, but all of them thought about the Donner Party, and they really didn't want to end up eating their friends. So they decided that they would either wait or there might be an alternative. Well, a guy by the name of Jefferson Hunt, who was a Mormon guide, had been from Salt Lake City, and he had gone down to San Bernardino actually and established a Mormon mission for Brigham Young. And Jefferson Hunt said, "Well, look, there's a trail. There's never been any wagons over it, but it's the Spanish Trail. It comes from Santa Fe, and we can catch it down around Provo, and we can take the trail down." So they did, and 400 folks or so, and I believe about 75 wagons or 100 wagons or so, they headed down, and they took what was called the Old Spanish Trail. Now, these people, you know, we think of these pioneers, but what they were leaving behind was incredible. This is Lorenzo Dow Stevens, and he was on the trail, and this was the home that he left behind in New Jersey. That's a really nice house. And there's trees, and you can see this is obviously wintertime, but in the summertime, I'm sure it would have been really nice. This home was built in 1815, still standing, I believe. And these people, they would get out there in the middle of this, wilderness and think, my goodness, what did I leave behind? Like Reverend Breyer and his family. And Reverend Breyer, along the way, never missed a beat in terms of preaching to folks. Folks got a little tired of it. He was a Methodist minister, and the person who was really the hero was Juliet Breyer. She carried her youngest child on her shoulders and then led the other children. Pops didn't really do much here. And she was really the heroine of Death Valley. And there's been books written about her, but Juliet Breyer really saved the Breyer family. And so you had those folks, and they come into this place, and this is what they see when they start to enter this deepest, driest, hottest valley in the Western Hemisphere. At its deepest, Death Valley is 282 feet below sea level. It's only about 156 miles long from north to south. It at its widest, it's about 8 to 10 miles wide, so it's a very narrow trench kind of, and it doesn't get much rain, about an inch and a half a year. It's the end of the Great Basin, quite frankly, because when you look at Nevada, you see all these mountain ranges, and they all run north and south. Of course, John Fremont had made a map when he came through, and he showed this wonderful east-west mountain range right about here on his map. And of course, the 49ers were following that map and thought, wow, somewhere there's a cool east-west mountain range, and at the bottom of that range, there's going to be nice streams, and there'll be a beautiful valley. And so a group of them with that John Fremont map said, you know, we're going to leave the old Spanish Trail. 25 wagons said, hey, we're going to leave the old Spanish Trail, and we're going to take a shortcut, because a guy in the party said, by the name of OK Smith, said, hey, look at this Fremont map. There's an east-west mountain range, and we could take the shortcut. But little did they know that the way the Great Basin operated was that every valley in between these mountain ranges got lower and lower and lower until finally you get to the sink, which is Death Valley. They entered through Furnace Creek Wash. Furnace Creek Wash is where the main highway now goes into Death Valley from Death Valley Junction, for those of you that might be familiar with it. And they would have seen a spectacular scene like this. This is now called Manly Beacon. This is from a place called Zabriskie Point, which is probably the most famous viewpoint of Death Valley, where you can actually get on the visitors platform there, look out, see the valley itself, the salt white of it, and see all these spectacular formations. Just as an aside, by the way, we did get funding from the Borax Company to start producing our film, and we were able to fly a helicopter. I was in a helicopter doing filming, flew right past this here. It was pretty spectacular. We had permission from the park superintendent to waive all flight restrictions, so we could fly as low as we wanted to. The Rangers didn't know about our permission, and tried to give us a ticket afterwards, but we showed them the paperwork and said, we're okay. So the Rangers said, okay, well, if superintendent says it's okay. So, but at any rate, that was some years later. But the 49ers continue their walk into Death Valley. They have their wagons. This is the Bennett family, Isabel Bennett and his wife, Sarah. And they had two little children, and they come into the valley on their wagons through Furnace Creek Wash, along with the Arcan family. And they have children. They just like others, they're looking for a better life in California. And then there are some single men like William Lewis Manley and his friend John Rogers. And they were with these families. Years later, in 1894, William Lewis Manley pens his memoirs called Death Valley in 49, which really became a classic pioneer account, which if you've ever read it, it's really a great read. But the families got into Death Valley. The single men, William Lewis Manley and John Rogers, were with them. And the families began to be really afraid that they weren't going to be able to get any further. They had found a little spring, and they stayed by the spring. Wasn't very good water. And the boys said, hey, we will go into wherever we're going, wherever we'll try to get out of here. Then nobody knew exactly where they were. and we'll try to find a settlement. We'll try to find some supplies and come back and rescue you. So the boys left, and off they went. It took them 13 days to reach the San Fernando Mission in Los Angeles, which, if any of you know LA, the San Fernando Mission is where San Fernando is today, Mission Hills, in the far end, north end of the valley. And there they got supplies. There was another place that was 30 miles, or I'm sorry, about 15 miles or so north, called the Asistencia, which is sort of where the farming little hut was that was set up as part of the mission. It's closer to, it's where Magic Mountain is today. Six Flags Magic Mountain is in Valencia today, if any of you know that. Um, and it was part of the San Fernando mission. So they go get supplies. It took them 13 days to walk to the San Fernando mission and the Asistencia. They got 2 horses and a one-eyed mule, and they head back to rescue their friends. The 2 horses died along the way. Of course, the little one-eyed mule made it, and they get to Death Valley. And this is a sketch that William Lewis Manley had drawn for his book. And he shows the Panamint Mountains here, which is the western mountains that border Death Valley. And the mountains we would be looking at, if this is our point of view, we would be up in the Funeral Mountains looking at this particular scene. And here you have the families there on the oxen. You can see how skinny the oxen are. Look how skinny they are. And they had their dog Cuff. And they put the kids on, and they head out of the valley. Now, when the boys come back to Death Valley, what they see is the wagons with the canvases off of them, and they don't see the families, and they're very afraid. On their way to the families, they had come across the body of a man by the name of Captain Culverwell. He had been with the 49ers. He wasn't feeling well, and he passed away in the valley. And so when they found Captain Culverwell, well, very descriptive by Manley, by the way, on his back, rigor mortis had set in, his arms were outstretched up in the air, and it was a very gruesome sight. And Manley was afraid that the rest of them were dead as well. And he actually thought the Indians perhaps had gotten them. Of course, he didn't realize the Shoshone Indians were just up in the mountains looking down at this weird sight with these carts and these strange animals. They had no idea what this was. And so they were watching the white man suffer so much when the Indians are going, hey, there's great water over here. And they just watched. And so Manley and Rogers, as they approached this wagon where nobody was there, they couldn't see anybody, they fired their guns in the air, and out from under the wagons come the families, and they run over. The boys have come, the boys have come. And so the guys are like, hey, we're glad to be back, but here's the bad news, we've got a long ways to go. And so they had started heading out of the valley. And when they got to one of the tops of the mountains here, over here in one of the passes, one of them looks back. And they thought about Captain Culverwell dead, and they thought about how close they had all come to dying. And they thought about the 23rd Psalm, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. Somebody in their party says, goodbye, Death Valley, or goodbye, Valley of Death. And so the valley got its name. Well, that makes for great copy, especially when William Lewis Manley goes to the newspapers and starts telling his story. The first time Death Valley appears in print, for anybody to think about that name, is 1861 in the Pasadena Star. But this particular article about the story of the Jayhawkers, which the Jayhawkers were one group that was in the San Joaquin Party. And by the way, because the party had decided to go over the desert, they were nicknamed the Sand Walking Party, sort of a bastardization of San Joaquin. And so the Sand Walking or San Joaquin Party had a lot of groups in it. The Jayhawkers were from Illinois. The Georgians were from Georgia, of course. They were called the Bug Smashers, and there were other groups in this party. Around the turn of the century, there was started to be um, articles written about them. This is about the time that Manley writes his book. Somebody in that party in 1849, 1850, as it was Christmas time, so about 1849 or so, around Christmas, somebody in the Jayhawker party had found a little chunk of silver, and they took that silver back to California to the gold fields, and they had that silver made into a gun sight for their gun. Somebody says, well, where'd you get the silver to make that gun sight? And they said, well, from Death Valley. They said, well, that's the gun sight silver. And so people started going back to Death Valley to look for what must have been a rich mountain of silver in Death Valley because of that known as the gun sight silver. Now, another guy that came along who was legendary, because not only did they find some silver in Death Valley, but there was also some gold found. And a guy by the name of Charles Breyfogle, who had been in Oakland, California, and then he went to Austin, Nevada, and he was sort of a ne'er-do-well, but had a reputation uh, for embezzling money, among many reputations he had. But one of the things he did was he went prospecting in Death Valley because he was going to find this lost silver or lost gold. And so when he gets to Death Valley, he actually um, uh, claims to have found a little bit of gold, and comes out and starts telling some people, and says, well, I'll lead you to where it is. And of course he charged them, and and starts taking them in, and then routinely he would ditch them, um, and leave them and come back out. But his story was that he had found the gold, and he showed up one day. Oh my gosh, my head's been bruised. I can't. The Indians stole my gold. And I can't remember exactly where it is. But he tried for years to show people where his lost gold mine was, and he became legendary. It became known as the Lost Breyfogle Mine. And so here's a picture from Death Valley out near Daylight Pass, if you know the area. And somebody put a little hand in where it shows where the Lost Breyfogle might be. This is the only known picture of Charles Breyfogle. I actually got a hold of this from the Breyfogle family. The photograph was in London with
Power off.
with the family, and I always got a kick out of this caption that the family had put down there: Uncle Charles Breyfogle lost mine. I never knew whether that was just descriptive of it was the lost mine, or whether they were upset about the fact that he lost the doggone mine. These two guys are Nevada senators. This is Senator William Stewart and Senator John Paul Jones. They invested in what they thought was the discovery of the Gunsight silver mine. And that was in a place called Panamint City, up in the Panamint Mountains of Death Valley. So the when we think about finding lost silver and lost gold, and all of that kind of thing, we really do think about just this making this wonderful discovery. And it seems that it's always the Indians really who end up pointing the guys to where the silver is or the gold is. So what we have here is the establishment of Panamint City by Senator John Paul Jones and by William Stewart. Now, both of them were not exactly the most honest guys, and most of the stocks that were sold were kind of, you know, not really backed up by anything. But they made a lot of money. And in fact, John Paul Jones made enough money to establish this little mansion in a place called Santa Monica. And John Paul Jones is actually credited with the building of Santa Monica, with the establishment of Santa Monica as a city. So, uh, some interesting tie-ins come in with the story of Death Valley and Panamint. So you can kind of see how a how it begins to build this reputation from the very beginning, with the 49ers sort of being the first Europeans to sort of quote unquote discover Death Valley, and the actual discovery of some minerals, and then this reputation begins to build in the press. And so a place like that's named Death must of course have incredible treasures. And so this mythology really develops about Death Valley. This is titled Hunting Lost Ledges in the Deserts of Nevada. And of course, Rhyolite was right on the edge of Death Valley. And we'll tell the story of Rhyolite, but it was a gold rush town right on the edge of Death Valley. And so this mythology really begins to take shape, and people are promoting the mines of Death Valley. Clarence Eddy writes, Death Valley is the treasure basin of the world. The New York World writes, Death Valley is the pit of horrors, the haunt of all that is grim and ghoulish. And so you have this juxtaposition. It's hell on earth, but it's guarding a treasure trove of riches. Well, if you were going to go out to Death Valley, you had to be prepared. And if you were going to look for those riches, you needed to know what to take with you. So the Prospector's Handbook would tell you. And here it is, a really great little view of what you would need: two pairs of heavy blankets, and you can see the burrow. And so these prospectors became known as single blanket jackass prospectors. That was what they would call these guys as they went out into the desert. Now, in 1900, so we have 1849, you have through the 1870s and 80s, there's beginning to be little rumors. 1890s, the book gets published, and Death Valley starts to begin to develop a reputation. But in 1900, many of you know what happened. There was a little silver strike in a place called Tonopah. And Tonopah was, really just, there wasn't much there except some springs. And I believe Tonopah means something like brush water or water in the brush, or, pa always sort of refers to water. And 1900, a guy by the name of Jim Butler, who is right there with his wife, Belle, they discover silver, and it starts a big silver rush. And by the way, we can mostly credit Belle because she really was the better prospector of the two. And of course, she named the big mine the Mizpah mine, meaning a blessing. And it certainly was a blessing to them because it made them awfully doggone rich. So Tonopah develops it. It really becomes the Silver Queen camp of the West, and it really revives Nevada. Nevada was on the skids. Some people, I'm sure many of you have heard this, some people actually wanted to have its statehood revoked because it had gone into such decline after the Comstock lode and into the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But Tonopah really revived Nevada, and it became a big boom. And of course, the happy prospector on their way out to make their big gold strike. And 20 miles south, you had another big strike. 1902, you had a big strike in a place that soon became Goldfield. And Goldfield became the largest city in Nevada, over 20,000 people, and was really the center of what was a 20th century gold rush, which I always found incredible in my research that very little media ever done on that fact. The fact that there was the last gold rush on the western frontier took place in central Nevada and then made its way down to the edge of Death Valley. So here you had Tonopah 1900, Goldfield 1902, and then you have 1904, you have a discovery made on the edge of Death Valley. This is a picture of Shorty Harris. Shorty Harris was one of the most colorful prospectors in the West. This picture was taken about 1915 by a guy by the name of Dane Coolidge, who has a pretty incredible photo collection, went out and caught a lot of the old timers in their prime. But Shorty Harris and his partner, this is Shorty and his partner Frank Ed Cross, or Ed Cross, sorry. This is Frank Shorty Harris and Ed Cross. They were out prospecting, and as Shorty tells it, he found a little bit of color in a rock the shape and size of a bullfrog. It was greenish in color. And he said, "By God, Ed, I've discovered gold, and here we go." And so they go and stake the claim. It was probably Ed that found it, but Shorty was the better storyteller. And so Bullfrog became the most famous gold rush location in 1904. Everybody was rushing to Goldfield, and it became legendary. This article is from the St. Louis News in St. Louis, Missouri. It was Christmas Eve in Bullfrog. Of course, Christmas Eve in the Greenhead Saloon. There was no such place as the Greenhead Saloon, but it really didn't matter to writers in the East or any place else. It was good copy, and there was a gold rush, and the Wild West was still alive. People were fascinated with the Wild West, and in many ways, they were reliving what they thought was the Wild West frontier. You got to remember Buffalo Bill's Wild West show is touring the country, and we had this, America had this love fest with the frontier, even though in 1893, Frederick Jackson Turner at the Chicago Exposition says, the frontier as we know it is closed. And that was supposed to be the end of the Wild West days, but it lived on in the gold rush happening in Nevada in the 20th century. And so these guys, people come from all over. They're dudes, they're dressed up, and then the old timer's going to lead them out and they're going to get rich. I love this picture of these guys heading out for Bullfrog in December. Then there was this guy. This guy was Bob Montgomery. Bob Montgomery was an optician in Tonopah, and he employed the services of Shoshone Johnny. And he said, "Look, do you think maybe you can find me something in this Bullfrog section? What's going on here?" And Shoshone Johnny was a Timbisha Shoshone Indian, and he found a location that looked pretty good. And so Bob had a prospector go develop it, and within 15 feet of the location that Shoshone Johnny pointed out, they struck a rich vein of gold. And Bob Montgomery said, "I have struck it. The thing that I have dreamed about all my life, I now have, and no one can take it from me." And then there's Mrs. Montgomery. This is Winnie Aubrey Montgomery, Bob's wife. Now, she didn't exactly take it from him, but she was the better business person, much like Belle Butler. U.S. Steel President Charlie Schwab came out to the Bullfrog from Pittsburgh, and Charlie Schwab was interested in investing in mining, and he was particularly interested in what Bob Montgomery had. Bob said, "I'll sell it to you for $1 million. I'll sell you my claims." And Winnie said, "Oh no, Bob, no, 2 million." And you know, Mr. Schwab agreed to Winnie's 2 million. And that established the Shoshone Montgomery mine. Now, what did Shoshone Johnny get? Not much. I think he got a grub stake, which means he sort of got a credit card at the local store where he could get whatever he wanted. And I think 24 bucks and a new pair of overalls. And that sadly is often the story. But this mine was very successful and it became the linchpin for the creation of a town nearby, which was called Rhyolite. And it was rhyolite is a rock, a type of rock, a type of pinkish rock that's on the surface. And they named the town for rhyolite that was in the area. And you can see right here, it's mostly tents uh, and people lived there along with this is Jack. I don't know why prospectors called their wife Jack. It seemed very common, and their dog Dutch. And here you can see a tent being moved into around town as they would well let's get it closer, get closer, move the tent. So it wasn't a very big process. You can see the guys picking it up, and off they went. The houses were just canvas and a wood siding, and that was pretty common for the living conditions in those days. But Rhyolite continued to grow. From 1905, it was established. This is probably about 1908, 3 years later. You have a huge big story bank here, the John Cook Bank building, and you have the ties here for the railroad. Here is the red light district. This is the Amargosa, and there were a number of establishments here. They were sort of had to stay in their lane, didn't get out much. There was the school, there was the Overberry building. So Rhyolite grew to almost about 10,000 people or so. It was going to be, as they touted it, the Chicago of the West. And of course, it was rich. Folks were there. They were, there was the Sack Door and Rhyolite in the background. But it also retained the Wild West. Here you have a stagecoach coming through town. So there's an era where you had cars and stagecoaches together, and it really does resemble the Wild West, though it was a modern 20th century town as well with electricity and running water. I found this letter in an antique store in Carson City, and it was written from Beatty, Nevada. And I love this line right here because this letter written in 1907 really captures the era of the Death Valley Gold Rush. And he's going around other valuable points in mining and prospecting. And when I buy me a jackass and start out, how I can fail is more than I can see. And I love that optimism written right there in that letter. And that really embodied why everybody was rushing out to the gold rush. And here they are, they got the little kid on the line. This is in Beatty. Beatty, Nevada developed a sort of a support center next to Rhyolite because it was where the water was, and it was also where the trains went through. And of course, Death Valley became more and more famous. I think its fame really reached its height around 1905. You had articles like this: the terrors of Death Valley, pitiable tales of lost gold seekers, the sufferings of just really really dramatic, written usually by Easterners who'd never been there. But there were folks who died in Death Valley, and Death Valley could be a dangerous place, particularly for people who weren't familiar with the desert. And they would come just to get rich, and off they would go, and they wouldn't take enough supplies. Still happens today. One of the most notorious deaths happened, though, was not a natural one. It happened in Skidoo, which was started by Bob Montgomery with the money he got from the Montgomery Shoshone and Rhyolite. And he established the little town of Skidoo, which they had found gold up in the mountains above where Stovepipe Wells is today. If you know the area at all, up in the Tuckeye Mountain, their area. And they established a little town. A guy ran a saloon by the name of Joe Hooch Simpson. And this guy was the most upstanding guy in town by the name of Jimmy Arnold. One day, Joe Hooch Simpson, who had syphilis, unfortunately, and was being treated for it by the town doctor, and also was the town drunk, Joe shot Jimmy Arnold dead because Jimmy wouldn't give him $20. And so the town got together and lynched Joe Hooch Simpson, hanged him from the local telephone pole in town. And of course, it was met with general approval, as you can see by the newspaper here, the Skidoo News. Well, Dr. McDonald had been treating Joe Hooch Simpson, and so what they did was they had thrown the body into a mine shaft, and Dr. McDonald got the body out of the mine shaft, and what he did was he hanged the body again in his tent to sort of replicate the hanging, and took a picture of it. It was not done by the newspapers, as people say. This was done by Dr. McDonald. But Dr. McDonald had more in mind for Hooch Simpson. He cut off his head. This, by the way, is the actual rope that was used to hang Joe Simpson. It's now at the Mojave Desert Heritage Center in Goffs, down in the Mojave Desert in California, at the Goff Schoolhouse. But this is Hooch's skull. Dr. McDonald cut off Hooch's head and cut the top of the open. He wanted to examine Hooch's brain, and so he cut off the head, examined the brain, and then he put the skull in a bag underneath his floorboard. Years later, in 1917, Dr. McDonald ran into some prospectors in LA at the Hollenbeck Hotel. And he said, look, if you guys want some real desert relics, go to my old tent in Skidoo. There's a relic there under the floorboard. And doggone, if those guys didn't go back, pull up the sack, and there was Hooch's skull. They took the skull to a doctor in Trona nearby and exchanged the skull for services. And they got their services. The doctor kept it on his shelf for many years, and gave it then to a local Trona resident by the name of George Pipkin. George kept the skull for many years, gave me an interview, told me about the skull, and then he gave the skull to a guy by the name of Dan Cronkite, where it resides now in Morongo Valley at Dan's bookstore. And so Hooch's skull still survives. His body, unfortunately, was tossed into the sand dunes in Death Valley, and on any given night, reportedly, the headless remains roamed the dunes looking for this particular skull. Not only were there dead bodies in Death Valley, but there were great promoters who used Death Valley as a way to get rich. This guy, George Graham Rice, was an incredible promoter. And what he would do is he would sell and promote stock. His best one was Greenwater. On the edge of Death Valley, they found a little bit of copper. And he got Carl Glasscock, who published this little newspaper called the Death Valley Chuckwalla. He got Carl Glasscock to sort of cooperate with him and publish this promotion about Greenwater. It lies in the heart of the marvelous Funeral Range, and deposits that in dollars amount to billions. And so stock went on sale for the Greenwater stock at the edge of the Funeral Mountains in Death Valley. They sold $30 million worth of stock on the New York Stock Exchange. And this was Greenwater. They only got about $2,500 worth of copper out of the ground, but sold $30 million worth of stock. It was the second largest stock mining swindle in the world. The first was done by a group of British guys some years earlier. But this was a huge stock market swindle by George Graham Rice. The other guy who really made good use of the desert was Death Valley Scotty. I'm sure many of you have heard of Scotty. Walter Edward Scott, born in Cynthiana, Kentucky in 1872. Scott went west with his brother and found a chunk of gold in Colorado. When he took a tour of a gold mine, they gave him a sample, believe it or not. And Scotty then went back to New York. He was working with the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. And in New York, he set a meeting with Julian Gerard, the president of the Knickerbocker Trust Bank. He took a little chunk of gold and said, Mr. Gerard, see this little chunk of gold? It's from my secret gold mine in Death Valley. And if you'll invest, you'll be part owner. So Julian Gerard gives Walter Scott $10,000, which was great for Scott because He had just been fired by Buffalo Bill for showing up late and drunk to the parade for the Buffalo Bill Wild West show because he was a trick rider, but had no job. And so the idea of going west with his $10,000 seemed really great. So Scott headed out. He lands around Barstow or so, and this is him. He would take people and try to show them his secret gold mine, selling them stock. This is one expedition, and he would basically lead them on a wild goose chase. But Scotty did this in 1902. The fortuitous thing for him was the gold rush of 1904. The Rhyolite gold rush happened while he was trying to con people into thinking he had a gold mine. So when they saw the gold rush in Death Valley, they were like, well, of course Death Valley Scotty has a gold mine. Look at all the gold mining that's happening around there. He became very famous. He was hired by one of the mining promoters to take a promotional ride across the country called the Coyote Special from Los Angeles to Chicago, and broke the railroad speed record. And the Santa Fe Railroad loved him. Ultimately, he became friends with Albert M. Johnson, and Johnson became friends with Scotty, and Johnson built himself a winter home, and Scotty called it his castle. And it became legendary, the friendship between the two of them. Johnson had a broken back and lived his Wild West fantasies basically through the stories of Scotty. They became good friends. And even though he spent lots of money on Scotty, he said, I did it because Scotty repaid me in laughter. So Death Valley becomes a place. It becomes famous. It becomes known for its gold and its riches. And even into the 1920s, people couldn't help themselves by taking advantage of it. C.C. Julian said, oh man, there's a lot of lead out there. And he's got people to come out from LA on the Tonopah Tidewater Railroad. And here it is, 1926. They're all out there, and he gets them all in cars and takes them into the backcountry to a town that he had built just to fool everybody into investing in his lead mine. And this was Leadfield out here in Titus Canyon, out in Death Valley. Quite a ride back into the backcountry. But the story of Death Valley's gold rush really is the story of people trying to get rich on the place that seemed improbable. Rhyolite. Years later, by 1910, Rhyolite was a ghost town. Everybody had left because the mine had tapped out. It had tapped out of its gold. And today you can visit the John Cook Bank building and you can see the ruins of it. It was so magnificent back in 1907, 1908. And today that's what's left. Rhyolite was really the sort of crowning jewel of the Death Valley Gold Rush. People went and visited in the 20s. This is what they would find. And what I love is this shot. This is Rhyolite. And look at this big chunk of potential wealth we have sitting in front of us. And these guys really embody, to me, what the optimism, the hope, and what people believed would be Death Valley's gold rush.
Oh, that was great, Ted.
So that's it. There you go.
There you go. So I know it's been a passion of yours for many years. Is there something that you were surprised as you kept unearthing these stories that you would never have expected, maybe? Or maybe the opposite, it's because you really paint a great picture, and you can tell you're a film editor, producer and all that, just telling this colorful story, but because there's such colorful characters,
Yeah.
other stuff. But was there anything that was just surprising to you as you discovered this?
I think what was really surprising to me, I mean, I had all my preconceptions about Death Valley, right? I think what was surprising to me as I really started doing this research was the number of people that were out there. If you were there at the turn of the century, it was populated. You would have run into freighters and people with their burros and cars. People would have their cars, because you go out there today and it's so silent, right? It's so quiet. There's nobody in Rhyolite except the tourists, right? A few people every now and then. There's nobody. You can go to Death Valley and be completely isolated. You can travel between Goldfield and Tonopah, and what's there? Nothing. You know, and that wouldn't have been true then. It would have been it would have been full of people. There were thousands and thousands of people out there roaming the desert. I think the other thing that I really I find endearing, and I interviewed George Hansen. George Hansen was the grandson of Indian George Hansen, and Indian George is the only officially recorded um, account from the Timbisha Shoshone point of view. He
Oh,
was a little boy in the mountains, and he got the and he recounts the story in a touring topics magazine, which was the AAA magazine at the time in the 1940 19 I believe it was 1939 or 1940. He lived to be 115. Indian George lived to be 115 in
um,
Panamint Valley at Indian Springs, and he got the nickname of Boy Who Runs Away because when he saw the white people, he was so afraid. He ran away. He hid behind a rock. And the the account, the idea that the Indians were watching these people suffering and dying, these 49ers as they came through in 1849. I didn't even mention how the Jayhawker Party got to basically where Stovepipe Wells is today, and they burned their wagons and abandoned everything and went out on foot. And there were more deaths on the valley in Panamint Valley and in the valleys subsequent to Death Valley than there were in Death Valley. There's only one recorded death in Death Valley, and that was Captain Culverwell that I told you about, who was found with the rigor mortis. So the idea that Death Valley gets this reputation where and there's newspaper accounts written about how hundreds of pioneers died in the vast depths of the valley. It's all BS. The only person who died in Death Valley was Captain Culverwell. But to your point, I love the account of how the Indians were so baffled by these people. Why they wondered why they couldn't find the water. It's right over there. It's right there, you know? And so it was a mystery to the Indians, and they didn't. And I think the thing that comes through is they didn't have any ill will towards those pioneers. They were just mystified. And the only reason that there was ever conflict between those 49ers and the Indians was because the 49ers robbed the gardens of the Indians over in Amargosa Valley. And the Indians had great gardens, and they had squash, and they had stuff. And of course, the 49ers were hungry. So they stole the Indians' food. The Indians didn't appreciate it.
I wouldn't either.
Right. So
I-
I found those, and there and the other thing I think was surprising to me is how people established homesteads there in Death Valley. I would think who would want to, you know?
Mhm.
And of course Furnace Creek became very very popular, but at the time of the gold rush, you had the Fairbanks family over in Ash Meadows in Nevada, and they had the Fairbanks Spring, and it was just a little outpost, and it was a family running it. And they were a way station for people traveling to the gold rush. But this gold rush was a thing. I mean, it was yeah. I love Sally Zanjani. For those of you who know Sally's work, Sally had always been a big supporter of my projects, and she was in my films, and we would always get into great discussions. And she really brought out how uh, it was the last great gold rush on the Western frontier, you know, and nobody knows about it. and I'd like to change that. But but when I say nobody knows about it, I mean I know that many of you do. But when I'm in LA, when I was by the way, I moved from LA to Vegas, thank God, and I'm really happy to be in Nevada because so much of my work is here, and I love Nevada and its history. And uh, when I was there, I mean, I would say, the gold rush in Nevada, and people go, "What are you talking about?" People they didn't know. They knew about the gold rush in California. They knew about, the 49ers and, because you have a football team, but they didn't know about the Nevada gold rush. So anyway, long way around your story. Your question, long way to your question.
Well, I know Neal was going to ask you a question, so.
Yeah,
Well, first, I've got a bit of a comment.
yeah.
Storyteller extraordinaire, mixed with facts. That's a good trick to pull off. I've thoroughly enjoyed your program. But I would like you to tell us a little bit about your books. You have 3 of them.
I do. I thank you, Neal. Oh my gosh, what a compliment from you. Thank you so much. That storyteller with the facts. Thank you, thank you. That means a lot to me. You have no idea. And by the way, speaking of facts, and I'm gonna get the book, but be on the for those of you on social media, Facebook and everything, be on the lookout for AI generated historical photographs. It's
Yeah.
really irritating. It is really irritating.
Yeah.
And I have 3 books. The first one I did was on the 20 mule team of Death Valley. So for those of you that know about 20 mule team borax or ever use it, it's in your grocery store today. This is the story of the whole story of the 20 mule team from the discovery of borax until it became a brand, until we reenacted the 20 mule team and got the actual mule team on the road. My second book was Death Valley Gold Rush, the one we talked about today. There's a lot more details in the book than I could ever go into in a presentation. And then the third one is my most recent one, which is Goldfield. And this is really a cool book because it's all of the photographs are from a private collection. I would say 90% of them are from a private collection from a friend of mine who collects Goldfield stuff. And he said, Ted, I don't want to just have this in my collection. Will you write a book and share it with everybody? And so it came from a personal photo album, which, a lot of collectors can be pretty, reserved about their collection, but he really wanted to share it. So there are some extraordinary photos in here, and a great story. And we go into one of my favorite. And you talk about surprising. Let's talk about surprise. I'm going to tell you what's surprising. When I was doing my Goldfield Tonopah Death Valley research way back when, I was in Tonopah and was going through the issues of the Tonopah Bonanza. And here were pictures on the front page of these racist images of this black man. And I'm like, what is this story? What is happening? And I found the story of Joe Gans, the first black boxing champion in America, and how he came to Goldfield and fought a 42-round fight and won. Well, that story has stayed with me, and we are in the process of working on a project um, on the story of Joe Gans, based on the book The Longest Fight by Bill Gilladea. And so that's one of the projects we're working on. But I have another project.
Did you make a movie or a film?
I have a 20-minute
Okay.
sort of a teaser piece on it on YouTube. You can find it. It's called The Longest Fight. It's on my Gold Creek Films website. But our newest
Yes, I was going to ask you.
Go,
Your
go,
newest
go. I'm gonna
adventure.
let you
No,
say
no,
it.
Ted and I have been friends for a long time, and so we contact one another every now and then. And I'm like, Ted, hey, I saw that, and so I was so excited when I saw your latest venture with Mr. Mark Hall Patton, and so I made sure I included it with our e-blast information. But I'd love for you to share a little bit about what you guys are up to. So
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Sherry. This is so much fun. So Mark and I, it's so weird. We should have crossed paths many, many years ago. We had so many people we knew in common. And of course, you know him from Pawn Stars, History Channel's Pawn Stars, which takes place in the Gold and Silver Pawn, world famous Gold and Silver Pawn shop here in Las Vegas. And Mark is the beard of knowledge, the man with the white beard and the Amish hat. And I reached out to Mark to help me with a documentary that I was doing. By the way, that's another project. We'll get to that someday. But about the pioneer women around Death Valley. And he helped me on that project. And when we were done with that, I said, Mark, we need to do something together. We need to get in trouble together. Let's do something. And he was like, I have a show I've always wanted to do. And I was like, what? And he said, we could never get it going on History Channel. And I said, what is it? And he said, well, very simple. Just going out to places that are accessible to people and telling a little bit about the history of unique and interesting places in the southern Nevada and the desert and even northern Nevada. We'll get up to Virginia City. So, but that's the idea. It's called Mark and Ted's History Adventures. You can look it up on YouTube. And we've got 10 episodes in the can. 3 have been released. The latest one was the story of Jean, Nevada. So if you've ever driven from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, you've passed a sign that says Jean. I always wonder, well, what's Jean, Nevada? But why is it called Jean, Nevada? And so we tell the story. And that's the latest one. And we the first one is just sort of an introduction between us. The second one, we tell the story of the last spike, the golden spike that connected Los Angeles to Salt Lake City on the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake line, which later became the Union Pacific, which still runs to this day. So we're just having a ball. Come have some fun with us. And we're open to suggestions, Hey, we think you guys should cover this. Great. So
Oh, I love that. I love that. That's very cool. I just knew that, you're such a great storyteller and just so passionate about all your projects. So I just knew with you coming to Nevada, I was like, oh God, I got to really get Ted to sign up and be
Oh
on the
man.
High Noon program. And I hope once we're back open to the public that we'll have to have you come on up and give a talk, but also do one of your films as well. So
Yeah, absolutely. Any time, Sherry. Anything for you, kiddo.
Yeah.
well, this was great. I'm so glad, Ted, that you agreed to this, and it was a great conversation, and I hope people enjoyed it and learned a little bit about history that maybe you knew a little bit about or not. But as always, thank you. So thanks, Ted. Thank you, Neal, of course, being our host, and the Washoe County Libraries. They're awesome, and I hope you
Absolutely.
make sure you check them out. And they're as old as the Nevada Historic Society, and we used to be in the same location at the state building at one point. And so they're a great resource. So you want to make sure you check them out. But without further ado, I'll send it back to Morgan, and thank you again.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks, Dad.
Oh,
Love it.
thank
Thank
you,
you, guys.
Nevada Historical Society, Ted, for your fantastic information, Neal and Sherlyn, excuse me. And then I want to thank Tim, who's behind the scenes taking care of all the tech, because that's important. So thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you,
Bye,
everybody.
everybody.
Glad you all came by.